The Orchid International Terminal was alive with motion, a restless current of humanity flowing in every direction. The soundscape was a messy orchestra, boarding announcements echoing overhead, suitcase wheels rattling against polished tiles, bursts of laughter, the cries of tired children speaking in languages from across the world. Neon signs glowed above long corridors, and the smell of coffee and jet fuel hung in the air. For most travelers, it was nothing more than another busy afternoon. For Maya Collins, it felt like wading through a storm she had no choice but to face. At 8 months pregnant, every step was heavier than it looked. She shifted the strap of her camera bag across her shoulder, the weight digging into her collarbone, the familiar pull of her lenses and gear pressing down like old companions. Being a photojournalist meant she thrived on chaos, but today, chaos pressed too close. Her free hand instinctively brushed her belly, as though reminding herself of the fragile life growing inside. She had learned to ignore the glances from strangers, those curious, lingering looks that silently asked why a woman so obviously expecting would still be hauling professional equipment through an airport. She knew what they didn't. Her work was her breath, her heartbeat, her anchor. She couldn't stop. Then it happened. A sharp bark cracked through the air. It wasn't just a sound, it was a command, an alarm, something primal that cut through the white noise of the terminal like a blade. The noise around her seemed to hush all at once, like the world was holding its breath. Maya stopped mid-step, her body jerking as instinct took control. Her hand flew back to her stomach, palms spread protectively over the swell of her child. Her heart thudded hard against her ribs, each beat a drum of sudden fear. When she turned her head, she saw him. A black German shepherd, sleek and imposing, stood no more than 20 feet away. His muscles were drawn tight, every fiber of his body coiled with focus. His name tag glinted against the canine harness strapped across his chest, Kaiser. His ears were sharp triangles, angled forward like spears, and his amber eyes locked onto hers with a stare so unyielding it felt less like being watched and more like being pierced. Beside him, his handler, Officer Daniel Hayes, tall, broad-shouldered in his airport security uniform, gripped the leash with both hands. His knuckles whitened as he tried to hold the dog steady. Yet Kaiser didn't lunge. He didn't move an inch. He simply stood there, issuing a low growl that rolled across the terminal floor like distant thunder. Maya's breath hitched. Her lips parted, but no words came at first. The weight of his gaze pressed into her skin, made every hair on her arms stand on end. She felt like the dog could see something no one else could, something hidden beneath the surface. Around her, the crowd shifted. A murmur rippled through travelers, a tide of whispered speculation. Phones rose, discreet at first, then more boldly, their tiny lenses catching the scene. Children tugged at their parents, pointing. A few people stopped walking entirely, transfixed by the strange standoff between the woman and the K9. Maya finally found her voice, though it trembled when it broke free. I didn't do anything. Her words were swallowed quickly by the space, drowned out by the growing hum of the crowd. She wanted to explain herself, to insist on her innocence, but her voice cracked with fear. She wasn't sure who she was trying to convince, the bystanders, the officer, or herself. Kaiser didn't blink. His body was as still as stone, his eyes drilling into her with unnerving certainty. The sound of his growl wasn't just noise, it was vibration, running through the floor and into her bones. And in that moment, standing frozen beneath the gaze of a dog trained to sense what humans could not, Maya felt a shiver twist deep in her chest. It wasn't guilt, it wasn't shame, it was something far worse. It was the creeping knowledge that something inside her was dangerously, terrifyingly wrong. Daniel Hayes knew Kaiser too well to doubt him. The German shepherd wasn't the kind of dog who barked for attention or spooked at random movement. Every sound he made, every shift of his body was purposeful. Refined by years of training, sharpened by instincts humans could never replicate. And yet this wasn't the standard rigid stance of contraband detection. This wasn't the raised tail and sharp nose that meant drugs or explosives. This was something else, something stranger. Something Daniel couldn't name but felt all the same in the tightening of his own chest. A supervisor in a navy blazer broke through the murmuring crowd, his expression carefully neutral. "Ma'am," he said firmly, but not unkindly, "we'll need you to step with us for a secondary screening." His words carried the finality of protocol, not suggestion. Maya's breath caught in her throat. For a moment she looked as if she might protest. Dozens of eyes were glued to her, phone cameras raised, whispers feeding on themselves like sparks in dry grass. She hugged her bag closer, as though it were the only shield she had left. But when Daniel stepped forward, his broad frame steady, his tone quieter than the supervisor's, she finally nodded. The short walk down the corridor felt longer than the entire airport terminal. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Maya's shoes tapped faintly against the linoleum, each step slower than the last. Behind her, Kaiser's claws scraped the tile, the sound sharp, relentless, almost impatient. The screening room was colder, quieter, and far too bright. The walls were stark white, the kind that reflected light instead of absorbing it, leaving nothing hidden. A single table sat in the middle, flanked by metal chairs that looked as if they had never been comfortable for anyone. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and static from the scanner, sterile enough to remind Maya of a hospital ward. She lowered herself into the chair, her hands trembling as they folded across her belly. Her lips pressed together, her face drained of color. The weight of the room settled over her like a judgment. An officer methodically unzipped her backpack, pulling out cameras, spare lenses, memory cards. Each item was examined, scanned, and lined up neatly across the counter. Another officer rifled through her suitcase, shaking out folded clothes, running gloved hands through every pocket. A handheld detector swept up and down each seam, blinking back nothing but green. Clean, all of it. From her seat, Maya's gaze flicked back and forth, following their hands. It was surreal watching strangers dismantle her life piece by piece, like turning the pages of her story without asking permission. The camera strap dangled uselessly from the side of the table, swaying slightly in the recycled air. She swallowed hard, wishing she could explain that her life was simple, ordinary, that she wasn't who they seemed to think she was. But the silence in the room pressed on her, making words stick in her throat. Outside the door, Kaiser's pacing grew sharper, faster. The scrape of his claws against the tile was steady, relentless, like a metronome that refused to stop. Every few seconds came a low whine, stretched thin with urgency. It wasn't the sound of a dog bored or impatient. It was something closer to pleading, as if the animal already knew the clock was running out. Daniel stood by the door, arms crossed, jaw tight. His eyes shifted between the officers, turning Maya's belongings inside out and the shadow moving back and forth in the hallway. He felt the tension in the air building, coiling around his spine. He knew that sound outside. He had heard it only a handful of times in his career, and each time it had meant something he couldn't afford to ignore. Inside, Maya tried to hold herself steady, but her composure was unraveling. She pressed her palms hard against her stomach, fingers digging into the fabric of her blouse, as if holding herself together with sheer will. Her breaths came shorter, thinner, her shoulders shaking with the effort of keeping calm. She could feel the eyes on her, the suspicion, the scrutiny, and yet none of it compared to the memory of the dog's stare. Those amber eyes had locked onto her like he could see through skin, through bone, into the places even she couldn't reach. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came. Just air. Just silence. The officers completed their search, stepping back with the efficiency of people who had done this 100 times before. They exchanged brief glances. Nothing suspicious, nothing wrong, nothing to report. But still, from the other side of the door, Kaiser's nails clicked and clicked and clicked, every scrape cutting through the sterile air. Maya closed her eyes, fighting the tremor building in her hands. She wanted to believe it was nerves, that the heat rising in her chest and the cold sweat trickling down her neck were nothing more than stress. But deep down, in the place where her fear coiled tight, she already knew the truth. Something wasn't right. And though she tried to sit still in the metal chair, her body had already begun to betray her. The sterile room was heavy with silence, broken only by the steady hum of the fluorescent lights and the faint shuffle of officers repacking Maya's belongings. She sat hunched in the cold chair, her hands trembling over her stomach, face pale and drawn. For a moment it seemed as if the tension might settle, that the worst was over. But then it hit. Sudden and merciless. Maya let out a strangled cry as her body folded forward. Her hands clutched at her swollen belly, her knees giving way as she slid off the edge of the chair and onto the floor. The strap of her bag clattered against the tiles, echoing in the still room. Her breathing came in jagged gasps, each one shorter than the last. "Get medical in here now!" Daniel barked, his voice slicing through the confusion. He was at her side in 2 strides, kneeling down, his hands hovering uselessly for a second before instinct forced him to steady her shoulders. Her skin was clammy, damp with sweat, and her eyes wide with a terror that made his own heart lurch. The door burst open, and a pair of paramedics rushed in, kits slamming down on the table. One clipped a pulse oximeter to her finger, another unrolled blood pressure cuffs with practiced speed. Numbers blinked to life on the monitor, and the readings made one of them mutter under his breath. "Pressure's unstable, heart rate spiking all over the place." Maya's lips trembled. Tears streaked her cheeks as she forced words past the tightening in her throat. "Please, not my baby." Her voice cracked, raw and desperate, the kind of plea that carried a weight no training manual could ever prepare anyone for. Daniel swallowed hard, his jaw clenching. He'd heard countless suspects beg, curse, cry, but this was different. This was primal. A mother's plea, stripped of everything but fear. An older doctor, summoned in the rush, pushed his way to her side. His presence alone seemed to quiet the room. He knelt down, his hands steady as he pressed them gently against Maya's abdomen, feeling with a focus born from years of emergencies. But almost immediately his brow furrowed, his movements slowed, then stopped altogether. His face tightened. "This isn't labor," he said, his voice low but heavy enough to still everyone. "It's an internal rupture. She's bleeding inside. If we don't operate now, both mother and child." He didn't finish. He didn't have to. The implication hung like a blade in the air. The officers exchanged glances, their faces drained of the authority they wore minutes ago. One of the paramedics froze mid-motion, then scrambled to prep IV lines with a new urgency. The silence in the room pressed tighter as though everyone was holding their breath. And then, from outside the door, came the eruption. Kaiser's bark tore through the hallway, fierce and unrelenting. It wasn't the sharp, controlled signal of detection. It was wild, urgent, pleading. He slammed his weight against the door, claws raking the floor, the sound like nails dragging across glass. The timing was uncanny, almost as if he had understood every word the doctor had just spoken. Inside, Maya's strength was unraveling. Her fingers gripped the sleeve of the paramedic nearest her, her knuckles white, her eyes pleading in ways words couldn't. Her body trembled with the effort of holding on, yet she seemed seconds away from collapse. Daniel felt a chill crawl down his spine. He turned his head toward the door, listening to the dog's frantic cries, and for the first time that day, he realized the truth. Kaiser hadn't been warning them about contraband, or a weapon, or a threat to the airport. He had been warning them about this, about her. Maya's breaths grew shallow, each one a struggle pulled from somewhere deep inside. The younger paramedic adjusted her oxygen mask, his hands shaking. "We're losing time," he said, voice cracking. The older doctor nodded sharply, already barking orders. "Get her on a stretcher. Clear a path. We move now." The room shifted from stunned stillness into frenzied motion. Equipment rattled. Gloves snapped. The table was shoved aside to make room. 2 paramedics lifted Maya carefully but urgently, strapping her down as she whimpered through the pain. Her eyes rolled back for a moment, then fluttered open, glassy and unfocused. Daniel leaned close, just long enough for her to hear him over the chaos. "Hold on, Maya. We've got you. Just hold on." Her lips moved, forming words so faint he almost missed them. "Don't let my baby." The sentence broke, fading into a trembling gasp that hit Daniel harder than any order ever had. Another bark exploded from the hallway, louder, sharper, reverberating down the sterile corridor. Kaiser's cries were desperate now, echoing the urgency inside the room. The dog's instincts had seen this coming before anyone else, and now his voice seemed to drive them forward, a relentless metronome that refused to let them forget how little time they had left. The stretcher clattered as its wheels locked into place. The older doctor's eyes met Daniel's for a fleeting moment, grim and unyielding. "If we're not in the OR within minutes, neither of them will make it." Daniel nodded once, his throat tight, his hand automatically brushing the radio on his shoulder. But his gaze drifted back to the door, where Kaiser's body slammed against it again, the sound vibrating through the metal. And in that instant, Daniel's fear shifted. It wasn't just for Maya. It wasn't just for the unborn child. It was the sudden piercing awareness that without that dog, without Kaiser, none of them would even have known what danger she was in until it was far too late. The moment the straps snapped into place around Maya's trembling frame, the room erupted into motion. Paramedics pushed the stretcher forward with the speed of people who knew every second meant the difference between life and death. The metal legs screeched against the tile as they folded upward, wheels locking into place before bursting into the corridor. The sterile silence of the screening room gave way to chaos. Fluorescent lights streaked overhead as the stretcher rolled into the open terminal. Passengers who had been murmuring minutes before now stood frozen, phones held aloft, capturing the scene with wide eyes. A tide of humanity parted as the team shouted commands. "Clear the way, emergency coming through." Voices boomed above the crowd, uniforms pushed against shoulders, guiding people aside. The murmur turned into stunned silence, broken only by the rattling of wheels and the sharp urgency in every paramedic's tone. And there, cutting through the noise like an anchor, was Kaiser. The black German shepherd surged forward, his paws striking the floor in perfect rhythm with the stretcher's wheels. His body was rigid, every muscle strung tight, his head low, eyes locked onto Maya, as if he alone could keep her tethered to this world. The leash pulled taut in Daniel's grip, but there was no resisting the dog's determination. Kaiser wasn't following, he was leading, guiding, carving a path as if the stretcher moved to his command. Maya's face, pale and damp with sweat, tilted slightly toward him, her cracked lips parted, and the faintest whisper slipped free. "Thank you." The word was fragile, almost swallowed by the cavernous terminal, but Daniel heard it. So did Kaiser. The dog's ears flicked back, his tail giving the smallest quiver, but his gaze never faltered. For Daniel, the sound of that whisper lodged deep in his chest. He tightened his grip on the stretcher rail, running alongside, matching every step. He thought of the moment in the screening room when Maya's body had folded in agony, the terror in her voice when she begged not to lose her child. He thought of Kaiser's bark before anyone knew what was wrong, the warning that had saved them all. Passengers pressed back against the walls, the ripple of silence stretching outward as the gurney rolled through. Some lowered their phones, guilt flickering across their faces as they realized this wasn't a spectacle. It was life hanging in the balance. A child clutched her mother's hand, whispering, "Is the baby going to be okay?" The mother only shook her head, eyes damp, as the stretcher flew past. The glass doors ahead slid open with a hiss, and the hot press of outside air rushed in, colliding with the sterile chill of the terminal. The world shifted again, from the neon glare of travel to the raw, pulsing urgency of survival. The ambulance sat at the curb, back doors thrown wide, its siren already wailing like a cry against the sky. Kaiser's stride quickened, his claws sparking against the concrete as he refused to fall behind. Daniel felt the pull of the leash burn against his palm, but he didn't try to slow him. He couldn't. Not now. The dog was too much a part of this moment, too much a part of what was holding Maya together. "On 3, lift!" one paramedic shouted. The stretcher rose, then slid into the waiting ambulance with practiced precision. The paramedics swarmed, securing IV lines, adjusting oxygen masks, fastening belts. The doors clanged shut, the sound final, echoing like a drumbeat against Daniel's chest. But before the ambulance surged forward, Maya turned her head one last time. Through the haze of pain, through eyes heavy with exhaustion, she found Kaiser in the blur of her vision. Her lips moved again, though no sound carried this time. Daniel didn't need to hear it. He knew. The engine roared, tires squealed against the asphalt, and then the ambulance was gone, weaving into the traffic beyond the terminal, its siren fading into the distance. For a long moment, the crowd stood in silence, watching the space it left behind. Then slowly they began to move again, their voices subdued, whispers soft, as though something sacred had just passed among them. Daniel remained at the curb, chest heaving, one hand braced against his knee. Kaiser sat beside him, panting hard, his ears pinned back, eyes still locked on the road where the ambulance had vanished. Daniel let out a shaky breath, finally crouching to meet the dog at eye level. His hand pressed against the thick fur of Kaiser's neck. "You kept her alive," he murmured, voice rough. "Don't think for a second I didn't see it. You knew." Kaiser leaned into the touch, steady and grounding, as if to say there was no other way it could have gone. Behind them, the terminal's noise crept back, travelers resuming their journeys. But for Daniel and for Kaiser, the world had shifted. The chaos of flights and schedules and announcements meant nothing compared to what had just happened. Because somewhere, rushing toward a hospital under blaring sirens, a woman and her unborn child were still alive. Alive because a dog refused to look away. The ambulance ride had been a blur of flashing lights and urgent voices, but once they reached the hospital, time shifted again. The frantic speed of the paramedics dissolved into a cruel, dragging wait. Daniel found himself in a narrow corridor outside the emergency room, the harsh white glow of fluorescent bulbs making everything feel colder, more unforgiving. The antiseptic smell pressed into his lungs, mingling with the metallic tang of his own nerves. He sank onto a metal bench, his elbows braced on his knees, his hands laced together so tightly his knuckles ached. Kaiser lowered himself to the floor beside him, the thick black fur along his spine still raised in faint ridges. The dog's chest rose and fell in shallow rhythm, his chin resting on his paws, but his eyes, those amber, unblinking eyes, never left the swinging ER doors. Every time the doors hissed open, Kaiser's ears flicked forward, his body tensing as if expecting Maya to appear. Each time it was only a nurse, a cart, or a hurried intern. The tension snapped back like a coiled spring, leaving both man and dog on edge again. Daniel's thoughts churned in endless loops. He saw the terminal replaying in his mind, the bark that had frozen the crowd, the low growl that had unsettled even him, the desperate cries echoing from the hallway as Maya collapsed. If he'd dismissed it, if he'd pulled Kaiser back and told himself it was a false reaction, if he had given in to protocol instead of instinct, she would have been dead already. His throat tightened. He leaned back against the cold wall, staring at the ceiling as if searching for answers hidden in the tiles. "You knew," he murmured, his voice so soft it was almost part of the air. He let his hand fall to Kaiser's thick neck, running his fingers through the fur in slow grounding strokes. "You knew before any of us." The minutes stretched into hours, or at least it felt that way. A clock above the double doors ticked with deliberate cruelty, each movement of the second hand mocking his impatience. Travelers had been left behind at the airport, flights resumed, the world moved on. But here in this hallway, everything was suspended on the outcome of a single surgery. Daniel wasn't a stranger to waiting. As a security officer, he'd waited for threats to surface, for alarms to confirm, for the slow churn of investigations. But this was different. This was personal. He wasn't waiting for a suspect or a clearance. He was waiting to know if a woman and her unborn child, people he barely knew but felt bound to now, would still be breathing when those doors opened again. Kaiser shifted suddenly, lifting his head, his ears pricking at some sound Daniel hadn't caught. The dog stared at the doors with renewed intensity, body taut again. Daniel straightened instinctively, heart pounding. And then, finally, the doors swung wide. A man in scrubs stepped out, mid-50s, glasses perched low on his nose, fatigue written across his face. He pulled off his mask slowly, letting it dangle from one hand. For one suspended moment, his expression was unreadable. Daniel's chest constricted, bracing for the words he dreaded most. Then the doctor exhaled, and a small, tired smile crept onto his face. "She's alive," he said simply. "The baby's alive too. They're both stable." Daniel let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. It rushed from him like a dam breaking, leaving him lightheaded. He blinked hard, his vision blurring as the weight of relief pressed tears dangerously close to the surface. The doctor stepped closer, his tone softening as he explained, "There was significant internal bleeding, rupture in a place that doesn't always show up on the initial scans. If she hadn't been brought in exactly when she was, neither of them would have survived. 10 more minutes, and it would have been too late." Daniel's gaze dropped instantly to Kaiser. The dog was sitting upright now, eyes fixed on the doctor as though he understood every word. His body finally eased, the tension slipping from his frame, though his gaze never wavered from the man delivering the news. "I don't know how your dog knew," the doctor added, shaking his head in disbelief. "But he gave us the time we needed. He saved 2 lives today." That was it, the confirmation Daniel already felt in his bones. He dropped to his knees, his hands reaching for Kaiser's neck, pulling the dog close. His voice broke with the force of it. "You saved them," he whispered, pressing his forehead briefly against the dog's thick fur. "You saved them, boy." Kaiser leaned into the embrace, his steady warmth anchoring the moment. His tail thumped softly against the sterile floor, not in triumph but in quiet reassurance, as if he had only done what needed to be done. Around them, the hallway carried on, nurses hurrying past, carts squeaking against linoleum, the hum of fluorescent lights never ceasing. But for Daniel, the world had narrowed to this: a man, a dog, and the echo of a miracle that had unfolded because trust had triumphed over doubt. The hours after the surgery bled together into a haze of waiting. The adrenaline that had carried Daniel through the airport, through the ambulance, through the hospital corridors, had drained from his body, leaving behind only exhaustion and a dull ache that seemed to settle into his bones. Yet he didn't leave. He couldn't. He sat in the same chair outside the recovery ward, his hand resting absently on Kaiser's back, his thumb moving in small, grounding circles through the thick black fur. The German Shepherd was stretched out at his feet, chin flat on the cool tile. He had been alert through the entire ordeal, ears pricked, eyes sharp, muscles coiled as if ready to leap into the operating room if given the chance. Now, with Maya and her baby alive on the other side of the wall, Kaiser's body had finally softened. Still, every so often, his amber eyes would flick toward the door, listening, waiting, guarding. It was deep into the night when a nurse approached. She was young, her ponytail slightly disheveled, her expression softened by the kind of compassion that comes from bearing witness to fragile moments. In her hands was a small folded piece of paper. "She wanted me to give you this," the nurse said quietly, offering the note. Daniel accepted it carefully, the edges warm from her palm. The handwriting inside was hurried, shaky, smudged in one corner, yet the words were unmistakable. "Tell the dog he's not just a guard, he's my angel." For a moment, Daniel just stared at the ink, the weight of the sentence pressing into his chest. His throat tightened, his vision blurred, and he had to swallow hard before he could breathe again. He read the line twice more, slower each time, as though committing it to memory. He looked down. Kaiser was watching him, head tilted, as if sensing the shift in his breathing, the heaviness in his chest. Daniel let out a shaky laugh that wasn't really laughter at all. "Hear that, Angel?" His voice cracked as he said it. "You're not just a guard dog, you're her angel." Kaiser blinked slowly, then thumped his tail once against the floor. Not exuberant, not boastful, just a steady beat like a drum marking the truth of what had been spoken. His eyes gleamed in the dim hospital light, not with pride but with something quieter, something deeper. The calm of a guardian who had done exactly what he was meant to do. Daniel leaned back against the wall, pressing the folded note to his chest. He thought about the terminal, about the way the world had seemed to stop when Kaiser barked. He thought about the panic in Maya's eyes, the terror in her voice, the pleading words she had whispered, "Please, not my baby." And he thought about how close they had come to losing her, to losing both of them, if not for the instincts of the dog now resting at his feet. In that moment, the job didn't feel like a job. The uniform didn't matter, nor did the protocol or the paperwork that would inevitably follow. What mattered was that trust had bridged the gap between human doubt and animal instinct. What mattered was that a life, two lives, were safe because a dog refused to look away. The nurse lingered a moment longer, watching the quiet scene unfold. Then she gave a small smile, almost reverent, before slipping back down the hall. Daniel stayed, unmoving, listening to the steady rhythm of Kaiser's breathing beside him. Outside, dawn was just beginning to creep into the sky. The first pale light filtered through the hospital windows, painting the sterile walls in soft shades of blue and gold. Daniel rose slowly, stretching the stiffness from his back. He gave Kaiser's leash a gentle tug. "Come on, Angel," he said softly. The words carried no command, only acknowledgement, an understanding that what had happened that day was bigger than either of them. Kaiser rose to his feet, shaking out his coat, his eyes bright and steady. He moved with quiet dignity, every step echoing the truth that sometimes heroes don't wear uniforms or speak words. Sometimes they walk on four legs, silent, steadfast, carrying the weight of lives and their instincts. And as the sun lifted higher, flooding the hospital corridor with light, Daniel knew he would never look at his partner the same way again.